Welcome, everyone. I'm Mick Fulton, as it says on the screen. I'm the publisher at Seren, and we're here tonight for the final event of Seren's 40th birthday celebrations. Who knows where those years went? Tonight it's fiction, and we have 4 excellent writers of fiction selected from what is, as you can imagine, a pretty long list of authors. The Seren fiction list stretches back further than our 40 years, all the way to 1915 and Craddock Evans's My People. And it includes novelists, major novelists, I think, like Emma Humphreys, and in translation, Kate Roberts, popular novelists like Sean James and Peter Benson, crime novelist Leslie Skaes, and look out for his Inspector Chard series, and debutantes, which we have one here, Francesca Rutherg, Richard Evans, Anne Lauper Dunbar, Alexandra Ford, Hamad Rind, most recently from Cardiff. We've also published a 10-volume retelling of the Mabinogion with authors like Owen Shears, Tishani Doshi, Trezor Sapadi, and Conan Jones. And that was a particularly exciting bit of fiction publishing for us, I think. And we haven't neglected the short story. We've got the classic Green Bridge, which is still selling 30 more years after first publication, and new collections from people like Angela Graham and Jackie McCarrick. So 4 authors from the Seren fiction list tonight. I'll introduce them as I go along. They'll each give us a short reading, and then I'll have a brief conversation with them. And after all 4 readings, we'll try to open out the discussion if there's time and take questions from you. And Sarah's just given you how to do that. So to our first author then, Iron Griffith. It's from North Wales, though he now lives and works in Cardiff. He's going to read from his first novel in English, which is Miriam, Daniel and Me, which was published during lockdown last year. Not the most auspicious time to publish a novel, but there we are. I'm sure he'll give some context about the passage that he's going to read. But I can tell you that the novel, it's a story of these friends, Miriam, Daniel and him, which spans 3 generations of life in a Welsh-speaking community in North Wales. It's a sort of love story, but it also takes in family discord, political turmoil, think about the investiture, poetry, jealousy, a simple twist of fate, everyone will get that, and football. So what more could we ask? Adam.
Oh yeah, thanks. Well, I thought I'd read this little section, which hopefully you'll like. When you die, an angel takes you from your coffin and leads you to a long staircase which comes down from the clouds. At the top of these moving stairs, there's a man called St. Peter, and he's got a very big book in front of him with the names of everybody who's supposed to come up that day. Why has he got names in there, 9? Because he's been watching to see if you've been good. Like Santa, St. Peter is far more important. St. Peter decides if you've been good enough to go through the big iron gates to heaven. What do the gates look like? Very tall and heavy. They're made of iron and painted black. But wouldn't they fall through the clouds and come crashing down? I embellished my question with a descending whistle, followed by my best explosion noise, and described a circle of smoke with my arms. They don't fall through, said 9. Maybe things were different in heaven. Maybe after we died, the laws of physics and gravity didn't apply. If anybody knew about these things, 9 did. She read her Bible every day. What's heaven like, 9? I sat forward with my head in my hands. 9 smiled and thought about it. Well, I want you to close your eyes and imagine the most beautiful place you've ever seen. I closed my eyes tightly. I thought of the Marine Lake Funfair in Rhyl. Are you imagining it? I nodded as hard as I could. Good. And what can you see? A roller coaster. Yes, well, there aren't any of those in heaven. Heaven is full of peace and quiet. It's where God lives. Does God have a house? Of course. Does it have stairs and a toilet and a fridge and stuff? Well, I don't know about that. But he must have a fridge to keep his milk in and to make sure that nothing goes off. I sensed that 9 was getting annoyed by all the questions about fridges. Everything that's important down here, she said, is not considered very important at all in heaven. Not fridges or television or pop music or anything like that. Heaven is about salvation. It's about being at peace with God. If you're good, and if you go to chapel and to Sunday school, and if you do what you're told, like your dad did when he was a little boy, and if you behave and devote more time to reading your Bible, then maybe you'll get to heaven one day. But I'd have to die first. We all have to die. I don't want to. There's nothing to be scared of, said 9, making me jump when her hands touched mine. If you've been good, then it'll be fine. But I wasn't good. I hardly spent any time reading the Bible. 9 had given me a brand new one for Christmas, and although I'd flicked through it to try and find any exciting bits, I'd given up pretty quickly in favour of the TV Tornado annual, which Santa had stuffed into my stocking. I was bad in other ways too. I picked my nose in chapel and wiped balls of snot under the pew. What counts as being bad, 9? Stealing, lying, swearing, taking the Lord's name in vain, not doing what one is told, refusing to eat Betty's carrots, burping. Burping always goes in the book. I'd refused to eat carrots hundreds of times. I shoved them to the corner of my plate every Sunday and squashed them with my knife to make them look smaller so that no one would notice. But St. Peter had probably noticed. He had X-ray eyes, and I burped all the time. I only said excuse me when my mum nudged me under the table with her foot. I wondered if St. Peter had heard me when I'd said fuck after dropping a shilling down a drain. He probably had X-ray ears too. I'll never get to heaven. Then you must pray. Pray to God and he will hear you. He will tell Jesus, then Jesus will tell St. Peter. Heaven must be a pretty special place if everyone wants to go there so much. 9 sighed and I opened my eyes. She was glancing across at the photograph of my tide on the mantelpiece, John Meredith, the tide I'd never known. It must be, she said, because when me and your tide were very young, he promised me that if he died first out of the two of us, he would come back and he would tell me what heaven was like. When he did die, and after they buried him in Llanddenyolyn Cemetery, I waited for him night after night, looking up to the stars. But he never did keep his promise. It was the only time he didn't. So yes, heaven must be really special.
Thank you for that. I don't know if you want to say something a little bit about where it stands with the rest of the book.
Well, 9 is a recurring character. She's 9 is the North Wales term for granny, and Tide is. I mean, she's based pretty much on one of my real grannies, who was fairly religious and fairly strict, and John Meredith is based on my paternal grandfather, who I never met actually because he died quite young, and he was a very talented singer. And he was a chap he worked in the quarry in North Wales, and he was very good at slicing pieces. He was a craftsman. He could slice pieces of slate, allegedly, very, very thin, like tiny, tiny pages, and therefore was considered to be quite important. But he came home one night and just sat in his chair and just died. And he was only about early 50s. And in fact, it happened in the early 50s as well. So that's what that little section is based on. I mean, it's kind of a self-contained piece in a way, which is why it's useful to read, because it doesn't give away anything in the plot. And 9 does appear throughout the book. And there's a very, I suppose if you've read the book, you'll be aware that there is a plot twist regarding 9 in there. Because Miriam, who's based on my mum, and Daniel is based on my dad. My dad was a poet and ended up being, in fact, the archdruid at the National Institute. Neither my mum and dad are sadly with us at the moment. My mum passed away, in fact, early this year. But, she had a chance to read this. I don't know what she made of it. I really don't. But the book is based on family history and bits of it that I knew about and bits I didn't. And I was trying to make sense of it. I'd seen some photos of my mum, for instance, with one of her previous boyfriends before she met my dad, called Padraig in Ireland. And I was always intrigued by this, but my mum would never talk about it. And I've seen photos of her in Dublin in the early 50s. So that means that she must have been quite serious about him to go over there at that point. So I was always quite intrigued by what happened. So I had to try and build what I thought might have happened based around what I knew. But that is the basis of the book, really.
This is the book. In case people haven't read it, you really should, because it's an excellent read. I think that the passage you just read and the idea of John not communicating what it was like in heaven, the book is a series of non-communications, isn't it? As much as miscommunications, really. And
yeah, well, I guess it is. Yeah, and I do remember actually her telling me that. I do remember her asking her that question: why didn't he come back to tell you what it was like? And she did say that it's the only time he didn't, and it rocked my faith a bit, because I thought, well, if I thought love can't be that strong then, and or maybe heaven doesn't exist. It made me think, even as a child, that I was questioning the whole thing that she based her life on, because everything that I was basing my life on were perceived as trivialities, and in fact they probably were. Things like the ephemeral joys of pop music and television, which were strange things to her and just couldn't get in kind of 60s and 70s North Wales. Those things they just weren't part of her world, but they were very important to me. So I suppose it's different clashes of culture, different times. There's elements, as you said, of politics and football in there, which was all part of my life growing up. And I'd written previous books in Welsh. This is my first novel in English. But curiously, I'd always written in English, always. My first book was written when I was 9, and it was called The Fastest Gun, which may surprise you to learn is a Western. And it wasn't so much published as ripped out of a little exercise book, stapled together and handed to my mum, and I even designed the cover. And to this day, I still don't figure out, I can't understand why Clint Eastwood hasn't bought the rights, So writing in English has always been there as part of my life, and writing in Welsh only came to me because I wanted to specifically write a book about Welsh television, because it was a world I'd been working in, and I wanted to write a satire based on that, and that had to be written in Welsh, and that led to a trilogy of books in Welsh. But I suppose writing in English has always been my first love, curiously, and it was all my literary heroes have tended to write in the iaith fain, as we call it in English, which is controversial, but it's nevertheless, and you might say sadly, I don't know, sadly or not, but it's true nevertheless.
Well, I'm sure the reviews of your first book by your mother were very good.
I'm still not sure if she actually properly sat down and read it. She'd always go, very nice.
Shocking. It's like child abuse, isn't it? But, you mentioned there writing novels in Welsh. Are there any differences, any similarities between writing in Welsh, a novel writing and writing in English?
Only in that, curiously, English has always come more easily to me than Welsh when it comes to writing, probably because I read more English books when I was a kid, and the whole popular culture world that I was obsessed with and absolutely infiltrated my brain as a kid, films, television, pop music, everything happened in English, and so when it came to writing in Welsh, I had to think more carefully about what I was writing, and I always worry a lot more about correctness, grammatical correctness and spelling mistakes in Welsh than I ever do in English, So those were the major differences. There were a few cultural reference points. I remember the publisher in Welsh often would say, they were very good, by the way, but they would say, can we change that reference point so that it's more Welsh? And I would sometimes feel a bit conflicted about that. Saying, well, that is not actually the world of the book. That is not, it. But certain things, the first novel I wrote in Welsh, Dyn Pob Un, just fell into place for me quite easily because it was a world of television that I knew really well. And I was so angry when I wrote it because I wanted to write that book because I felt, and sometimes anger is the best basis for satire. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to get that book out there. With the other two, it was a bit more of a considered effort. And in fact, the last Welsh language book I wrote, which was called Tri Deg Tri, which is about, I suppose loosely, you could in an elevator pitch, you could say it's about a hitman who talks to animals, which is definitely true, but it's about many other things as well. And that for me was almost like an English language book written in Welsh. And I really want I really fancy translating that at one point because I feel it would work in English as well, that book.
That sounds interesting. You mentioned also your work as a radio and TV producer, working in the media.
Yeah.
apart from your anger at that particular world.
I'm a lot more kind of relaxed now.
Good. I mean, any kind of crossover in terms of your literary processes from TV production or radio production into novel writing?
Well, I think radio more, because I used to present a daily programme on Radio Cymru, in fact, which was a pick of the day, which was quite hectic, because you start every day with a blank page, and then you had to go in, listen to the radio output, and present a live anthology at the end of the day, the best bits of the day's radio, and weave it into an amusing and hopefully coherent narrative, which is what I did. I did that for something like 4 years. And then I presented what people must think is possibly a dream job of being a holiday presenter on S4C, which involved doing pieces to camera and very often coming up with them on the spot. Very often the camera crew would stop and say, this is a good spot, just by this cathedral. Can you do 30 seconds on this cathedral? So you had to think, okay. So in a sense, that stress, that level of stress can be quite useful. And also communication, because radio is great for that. It's you and a microphone, but the microphone leads to one person, and very often a very distinguished presenter, Paul Gwynfryn, told me that you broadcast to one person, not to a group of people, but to one person. And I think writing is similar in that. Your relationship to the page is basically to one person. And the minute you think of writing to a crowd, then it becomes something different, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, perhaps we can take that up later when we talk to the others. But thanks for that, and we're going to move on now to the wide open spaces of Patagonia and Claire Dudman, who's also from North Wales, actually. I think from a different part of North Wales, and now lives just across the border near Chester, a place which she lovingly recreated for Seren in her volume Real Chester. Claire is a novelist. She won the Catherine Fiddler Award for Edge of Danger, her novel for children. And Real Chester was a sort of local book for her in a way, as you can see from the background on her screen, in the sense that she's also published novels set in a mental asylum in 19th century Frankfurt, and a novel set in the Arctic, and also I think in Copenhagen. Her novel for Seren is, hint, A Place of Meadows and Tall Trees, which tells the story of Welsh emigrants to Patagonia. And it's from this that she's going to read now.
Thanks, Mick. And thank you to Seren, and congratulations, 40 years. What I'm going to read is just from the very beginning of the book, the preface, so I don't need to introduce it. North Wales, 1863. Old Hannah Lloyd was roused from sleep by the dogs. Intruder. Their bark should have made her frantic, but she paused for a few seconds to touch the other side of the bed. Of course he wasn't there. A dream, that's all it had been. She took the impression of his hand from her shoulder and the warmth of him from her back. Gone for good he was. A renewed burst of barking made her crawl from the coldness of his side, grip onto the walls of her bed and let herself down. These days it did no good to hurry. The world had become treacherous, with objects obscured by the thickening skin of cataracts. The dogs were at the door, leaping at it, snarling. When she lifted the latch, they were away into the haze of morning light, yapping absurdly at something. Then before she could open the door fully, there were shouts. One high-pitched scream, which could have been an animal or human, and then the sound of a gun firing, once and then once again, and then silence. Gwyn? Anwen? She stood at the door, peering dimly through the bright air. Where are you? She felt for her shawl, pulled it around her, and then started slowly along the path. In the haze that now afflicted everything, she could hear whimpering. Gwyn, is that you? She waited, her head tilted to the side, listening. The whimpering changed pitch. She stepped forward again. Who's there? Who is it? She'd gone beyond the garden now, past the wall and into the meadow where there was no path. A few paces more, and she trod on something soft. She stumbled, her arms out, her knees sinking into something warm. Anwen, her favourite dog, her old friend, the golden fur and the black eyes. She shuffled backwards, caught his head in her hands and clutched tightly onto his ears. The animal whimpered again and his eyes closed against her hands. Anwen! Behind her, the long, dry grass snapped and broke. A foot in a boot nudged Anwen's rump, and then a single sudden wrench pulled her to her feet. She could just see the cloth of her jacket. Good stuff. Too good for anyone she knew. She tried to pull herself away, but whoever was holding her had a grip like lockjaw. You had Sir Philip's letter, didn't you? The boot nudged at her, just as it had nudged at the dog. You have to be out today. Understand? Your son, the one with the big ideas, didn't vote for him. His lordship didn't like that. They saw the fire from the lakeside, a glow on the hill that drew the eye, but it was the nose that was drawn first, the smell of a life burning, all its hopes, its memories and disappointments. The old woman would not be consoled. Her daughters and then her granddaughters took turn in bathing her wound and talking to her, but she would not speak back. For days she sat outside their house in the street, on the wall and then on a chair, watching where a spiral of smoke beyond the lake grew smaller. People said she couldn't see, and yet she still watched. And when it was entirely gone, her eyes closed. Days later, when she opened them again, it was obvious to everyone that her mind had gone too. That's a start of it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Claire. So that was the preface, as you say, and that's a sort of the bed from which the novel grows, isn't it? And the reason why people undertook the journey from one end of the earth to the other, really.
Yes.
So, I mean, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about what happened to the settlers as, when they arrived in Patagonia?
Well, they were promised a green land, a place with tall trees and meadows, hence the title of the book. But when they got there, it looked like this. It's the desert, basically, except the green bit is the bit that the Welsh have made in the desert that you can see on Google Earth in Patagonia, which they did by irrigating it. But when they got there, it was this desert. And so it was in 1865, miles away from anywhere. It took them about 2 or 3 months to get over there in a sailing ship. So they were isolated from anybody, and that sort of total isolation, and they survived, though they tried to get out of it at one stage, but they kept going and eventually made a big success of it, really, and is still there, speaking Welsh in a valley in Wales and also in the Andes.
Yeah, I think that's a remarkable thing, isn't it? And the return of Patagonians when we're COVID-free to the Eisteddfod is always something that's televised and remarked upon. Your novels for adults, they're all set in the past, and I know you've recently been writing about the English Civil War, I think. Is it the possibility of researching them? Is that an important factor in the subjects that you choose? I mean, I ask because you've got a background as an academic researcher, although I think in chemistry, not English.
Yeah. I got a PhD in science, and I spent some time researching science. So, but I think you learn how to research when you learn how to research, and you can apply it to other disciplines. So, I quite like learning new stuff. So, I don't know why I did history though, because it wasn't my best subject at school.
But it's a task that you set yourself then to...
I just find it really interesting. It's probably getting older, get more into the past.
I don't know about that. And from that, you're then able to do something that perhaps chemists don't do, which is recreate a world and people it with characters.
Yeah. It's the wildernesses that I like though, because one was in Greenland, there's nothing but ice and not very much. And this attracted me because it was desert. I do like wildernesses. Then there's Chester, which isn't wilderness.
That's a foul slur on Chester, I'm sure. I mean, my other question I've got written down here is, what was it about the Welsh colonisation of Patagonia that appealed? Your other novels are about people under pressure quite often. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Wegener in the Arctic. I mean, is that a kind of common theme as well?
Yeah, I suppose so. I hadn't thought of that, yes, but it gives you a story immediately, doesn't it? If you've got somebody under pressure, how they're going to cope with it. Yeah, it was the irony of the story, really. These people going out there to keep themselves Welsh and to preserve the culture, and preserving them from an English kind of influence, like a lot of them were doing in North America. They found they were losing the Welsh after one generation. So they went to South America, the most remote place they could find. And the irony of it, two ironies really, the idea that by going there with their culture, they sort of accidentally also got rid of the Telwelshi culture, which was the indigenous Indians that were there. Their culture went, so they replaced one with another. But also the Spanish culture, in the end, to some extent, overrode the Welsh. And it's only after the 100 years anniversary that there was this big interest in Welsh going down there in South America. So,
yeah, I think it is interesting. I think that that although they faced tremendous obstacles to survival at the beginning of their journey in Argentina, I mean, the culture that they wanted to preserve is still there. The Welsh language is still spoken, as you've said. Yeah. Less fortunate for some of the indigenous people, as you say as well. And we actually published a very interesting travel book called Beyond the Pampas by Imogen Herod about that. Thank you for that. Thank you for showing us Patagonia and Gaiman in the background. Want to move on now to David Llewellyn. Once of Pontypool, it's South Wales time now, but now a Cardiffian. We published 4 novels by David, starting with 11, which is set in Cardiff and is written entirely in emails on the day of the attack on the World Trade Center. I can recall picking up the manuscript from David, an unknown author, one evening in the office and not being able to put it down. I think it's a remarkable debut. On our website, we call it part The Office, which was very current at the time, and part Beckett. David continued to look askance at the world, particularly the contemporary world, in Everything is Sinister and in Ibrahim and Rini. But this evening, I think he's going to read from his most recent novel, A Simple Scale, which is a compelling sweep across the 20th and a bit of the 21st century as well, set in Hollywood and New York and St. Petersburg, and another remarkable look at ourselves. So, David, if you want to give us some words.
Okay, so I'm going to read a bit from early in the novel where we meet the composer character, Sol Conrad. We see him in New York in October 2001, but we also see his career as working in the studio system in Hollywood in 1950. So this is kind of, we've seen him in work and now he's on his way home. Santa Monica Boulevard, roof down, a sassy version of Duke Ellington's Caravan playing on the radio. You glance up at the rearview mirror and see the Hollywood sign in reverse. That thing was falling apart when you first moved out here. Its letters a dusty shade of brown. The H caved in from where some drunk had crashed his car into it. That's true, by the way. Some of the studio old-timers thought it was important, the end of an era. But since then, it's been given a fresh lick of paint and sits gleaming up there on the hill. This is a perfect Los Angeles evening. In New York, it's snowing and struggling to get above 25 degrees. When you hear something like that, it's hard to miss the place. The canyon is always a surprise, never mind that it's been, how long now, 9 months? Even after 9 months, you still take that right onto Laurel Canyon Boulevard and the city is gone, replaced by brown slopes dotted with dark green. Italian and Art Deco villas lining the hillsides, and the air rich with the almost overpowering fragrances of bricklebush and Jeffrey pine. You park up in front of the house, turn the ignition, the engine falls silent, the music cuts off. Inside, you pour yourself a scotch. No ice, just a squirt of soda water, the way Ron used to take it. He looks at you smiling from a picture taken out near Patchogue in the summer of '47. The two of you in short-sleeved shirts, both smiling, arms hooked around each other's shoulders. Funny how deceptive a picture can be. You were happy that day, but the days and months surrounding it were miserable. Jobs were few and far between, and the little work you had with off-Broadway theatre and a handful of TV networks was far from well paid. Ron secured you a few days here and there, transcribing pieces for sheet music, and there were a few session gigs, but you were hardly the talk of the town. You watched as men your age wrote ballets and symphonies and Broadway shows, and you were consumed with envy. But that weekend in Patchogue was a happy one. The photo shows the Ron you knew, not the man who now gets written about by critics and academics. The man in the picture is the one whose voice you hear in letters you keep beneath your bed, smiling and carefree, at times almost boyish. Good God, you miss him. You sip your drink and look out again through the window at the terrace and the lawn. Once again, it's been trashed. Clumps of earth all over the place, the trash can on its side and trash spilling out everywhere. It looks like a war zone, third time this month. God damn it. The culprit's nowhere to be seen. Probably happened during the night. Didn't even notice it this morning. Got up, got dressed, made coffee. You were in the car and driving into Hollywood, and the whole time your backyard looked like this. Out on the terrace, it gets worse. Whatever did this took a shit, or rather a series of shits, all over the lawn, so that all you can see is shit. Told you, says a voice from next door's garden. Should have put bricks on your trash can. Mary rests on the fence with folded arms, a cigarette dangling from her lip in an ebony holder, the ash threatening to fall into a martini. Her eyeshadow is a little heavy this evening, giving her look a touch of Dia de las Muertas. Other than that, her hair is immaculately coiffed as ever. Her gown, an oriental-style 1920s original, you'd guess, still fits. Garlands of orange and green costume jewelry hang around her neck. You think it's raccoons, you ask? Gotta be. We had the same problem when we moved here back in '36. I just don't get it. If they're after the trash, why don't they just go after the trash? Why this? Because they're vermin, and they think this is their territory. Their territory? We're in LA, for Christ's sake. Don't let that fool you. We're in the mountains here, Saul. About a month after we moved here, my late husband, may he burn in hell, saw a cougar in the yard. A cougar? Sure, there's cougars and coyotes all around here. Still, for my money, raccoons are the worst. They'll just tear the place apart, as you can see. Say, what's your poison there? She takes the cigarette holder from her lower lip and points its stem at your drink. Scotch. Before 6, a man after my own heart. Why don't you hop over the fence and bring the hooch? If you like scotch, I've got a bottle I picked up in England around here somewhere. I don't know, Mary. Maybe you should be saving that for a special occasion. Saul, I am 51 years old and haven't had a call back in months. If I save that scotch for a special occasion, I'll be cremated with it, and the explosion will take out half of Southern California. You join her on her terrace, similar to your own. Both houses were built by the same architect, but busy with dying pot plants. Above the mountains, the sky is lilac, and you can hear cicadas chirping in the scrub. I'm just not used to this, you say. I mean, raccoons, cougars. I grew up in New York. The only wildlife there is rats. Plenty of rats in this town, too. It's like living in a goddamn menagerie, Mary laughs. She refills her glass and passes you the bottle. Reminds me of Intolerance, she says. Every day that set was like a zoo. Jaguars, elephants, donkeys, and doves. Every day there'd be a new animal on set. And one day, these two stagehands are carrying a stone lion, except it isn't really made of stone, it's plaster of Paris or some such. So they're carrying this stone lion, and they almost drop it as they're walking past Cena Owen. She was one of the actresses, had a bigger part than me, but we went way back. Well, Cena screams like you'd think it had crushed every bone in her foot. You've heard the story before, but you don't tell her this. Instead, you top up your own glass and add a dash of soda from the siphon. And Mr. Griffith, he just says, Sina, 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 calm yourself, woman. That thing wouldn't have squashed a fly. A brief pause. Cicadas. The twin prop airplane yawns and potters its way across the sky towards Burbank. Is it true, you ask? What you said about not having any callbacks? I am going through a real dry spell, Saul. It ain't funny being 51 in this town. Too old to play the damsel in distress, too young to play grandma or mother superior. Besides, even when I am old enough to play mother superior, I don't think I'm exactly the habit-wearing type, do you? My only habit is this stuff. She lifts her drink and swirls it around, the ice cubes jangling against the glass. But you've got it easy, you composers. I mean, never past your prime, and the movies will always need music for as long as there's movies, and if that don't work out, there's always TV. You know, I auditioned for a TV show last year, some Buck Rogers piece of crap called Captain Video. You know what they told me? They said I was too big for the small screen and gave the part to some radio actress. And now I hear they've cast Vivian Leigh as Blanche in Streetcar, and an English woman playing Blanche. That said, same bitch went and got herself Scarlett O'Hara. Not that I'm busy. Everyone auditioned for that part. I believe even Danny Kaye gave it his best. Anyway, I called him up as a studio. I called him and I said, I'm just checking my name is still on file because these things happen. Your file gets misplaced and suddenly you don't exist. So I called them and I said, am I still on file? And they said, sure, you're still on file, Miss Lafayette. And I said, well, that's funny because last time I checked, I was a Louisiana-born actress of a certain age, and yet I was not asked to audition for Streetcar. What did they say? They said Mr. Feldman and Mr. Kazan already had an actress in mind and that open auditions were not held. Mary throws another couple of ice cubes into a glass and drenches them with scotch. The ice cracks. But they can all go to hell, she says, and somewhere in the mountains, as if agreeing with her, a coyote howls.
Thank you for that, David. Yeah, I mean, one of the things about the novel is that there's a lot of vermin about, isn't there?
Oh, yes.
Do you want to say a little bit about the novel?
Okay, so
the three main characters, maybe.
So the three settings are not the present day, but 2001 in New York in October, and Natalie is the PA and kind of almost carer to Sol Conrad in his later years, where he's got dementia and, you know, just needs a little bit of help around the house with his correspondence. He's famous for writing a TV themes in the 70s. And what happens is a young guy from Russia turns up and says that this music was stolen from a piece that his grandfather wrote. So then that takes us back into Sol's life in Hollywood in the 50s, but we also find out what happened to the young Russian guy's grandfather, who had been a composer, but also fell foul of the state in the late 30s. But the stories are told in kind of different orders. So the Soviet side of it is told in reverse. We see him on the day that he's kind of been released and sent back to Leningrad and meets an old friend, and it's awkward. And then we kind of work his way back through him being in a prison camp in the north, working on a railroad that was leading to the prison camp in the north, and then via his arrest and back to his career, you know, and back to him actually having a career. So yes, sorry, I could probably waffle on age, but that's kind of the core of it. So then we get the Hollywood experience of the 50s with all the tensions of that, and we get kind of New York in the almost immediate aftermath of 9/11. Some of which, I mean, the one I was most familiar with was probably New York, because I've been there, and obviously I've spoken to friends of mine who live there, and, you know, spoken to them about what the experience was like, and met other people from New York who've been able to kind of give me some impression of it. But yes, sorry, Nick. Sorry.
I mean, it's difficult to sum up the book in the sense that it covers such a lot. I mean, there are a lot of isms in it. So there's the Soviet Russia and the Stalinist terror. There's McCarthyism in America and Hollywood in the 1950s. And of course, there's also, what should we say, attitudes towards gay men, because the two main characters, Sol and Sergei, are both gay men.
Well, Sergei, I think he's more complicated because we know he's got a grandchild. So and he also has affairs, without spoiling too much, he also has affairs with two colleagues in the Kirov ballet. A male ballet dancer and a female ballet dancer. So, you know, I think I would probably define him more as bisexual. Sol has been married at some point, but we get the feeling that his heart wasn't really in it in any way. So yeah, but it is about that era where, to a certain extent, people were having to live very secretly. The Hollywood side of it is interesting because there's a lot of myth making. You have Kenneth Anger's book, Hollywood Babylon, which was, I mean, pretty much largely a fabrication, but got taken very seriously. So people are like, oh my God, they were all at it. But it is mostly Kenneth Anger just making it up. So it was finding the true stories, finding the real accounts from people at the time, where there was a little bit more weight to them. So, you know, where, you know, people could kind of verify what they were saying, and it wasn't just the myth-making side of it. And there is some stuff on what life was like in the Soviet Union, because there was a brief period where actually following the revolution, homosexuality was decriminalized effectively, because they just torn up the rule book. But it didn't take very long for them to, certainly once Stalin was in power, it didn't take long for them to kind of recriminalize it. So it would have been that, but it still went on. And obviously we know that, within the ballet world, you had people like Rudolf Nureyev and so on, although he had to leap over a sofa in an airport to make his escape. But yes, so that is a big part of it.
We're glad that you did, rather like Claire, do the research and find all the stories, because this is a really good page-turning novel, which I'd recommend to anyone, as indeed I would with 11, the email novel. So finally, for tonight, it's Chris Meredith, another South Walian, this time from Tredegar, a Welsh speaker, although yet to write for adults in Welsh. He has written children's books in Welsh. Chris is also an acclaimed poet, and this year Seren published simultaneously his new poetry collection Still and the new short novel called Please. And there can't be many authors who have achieved simultaneous publication in two genres, I think. Chris is another author whose first typescript I remember reading in a different office even longer ago than David's typescript. It's another one of those, for me, publishing moments of recognition of a really, really good book. And that was Shifts, which is a gritty novel set in and around the steelworks of Ebervale. And it's notable in all sorts of manner. And I think it was it not second in the best novel from Wales vote organised by the Welsh Arts Review for the 20th century? That's not bad going either. Chris followed Shifts with Griffrey, Sidereal Time, the beautifully titled The Book of Idiots, a collection of short stories called Brief Lives, and this year, as I've said, Please. And tonight he's reading from, and I've got ... because I'm not quite sure. So Chris, perhaps you'd let us know.
Thanks, Mick. Good evening, everybody. I'm still not sure, Mick, so while I'm deciding, I'll say hello to everybody, and it's great to see some familiar faces in the audience, and Jeannie and John, but also several people I haven't seen in some years, Anna Dear and Leslie Ingram, and lovely to see you again. And Abia, nice to see you again. We keep meeting in virtual events, Abia. It's lovely to see you again. I think we met once in the flesh, and all of these times online. Yeah, Please is the new novel, and it's got a comma on the front, a giant comma, and the book of poems called Still has a picture of a crow on the front, and it's only half an accident, that they are both kinds of punctuation marks. And people have been looking for connections between the two books, and maybe there aren't many, but that's definitely one of them when it comes to the contents. I'm torn. I was very tempted to read a piece from Please, but I will be in the Hay Winter Festival in a few weeks' time talking to John Gower, and I'll be talking about Please and Still There. And to be frank, I've been talking about those two books for quite a while now. So for a change, I'm going to talk about or read a piece from a short story in this little totally unoriginally titled book, Brief Lives. And I'm very glad that Mick mentioned short stories at the start. An incredibly difficult form, I think. And I think some of the energy that I might have put in the short stories actually went into poems down the years and still does. So there are just 6 stories in this book. One of them is quite a long one, and there's a second quite long one. But I want to read just 5 minutes from one of the shorter ones. And it's a story called Progress. The thing that emerged in this little book is that each of the stories in it kind of encapsulates a life. Maybe not an entire life, but you get a sense of a whole life in each story. That was the kind of thing that emerged. And in this one, they're arranged sort of loosely chronologically, and they start in 1946, and they end at the end of time in the final story. So I'm interested in that idea that you can compress a lot into a tiny space in words. So time is kind of elastic and relative in a kind of a private way, a personal way for the reader. And in this story, it's about 1950. The man in the story is about 30, and he has been a coal miner, managed to get out of the pit during the war. He's now a railwayman and he likes his job, but he's not earning enough. So he and his wife decide he's got to go back and see if he can get a job back in the pit. So this is about that return, and he's going back to see if he can get a job in the pit. And he's got off a bus and he's halfway across a footbridge to the pit head. And the footbridge crosses railway lines. And he stops and he has a cigarette, and he can see the yard and the pit heads, and he can smell it, and he can hear the compressors dragging air down into the pits, and it kind of brings back what it's like. And he doesn't want to do this. So this is about that pause. This is just 5 minutes from a story that would only take 12 minutes to read altogether. Underneath the bridge, instead of a river, there were railway lines on different levels. The standing coal wagons filled and waiting. In his first week, 16 years before, helping to put a prop in, he had lost 3 fingernails. In the monochrome lamplight and the fuzz of dust, there'd been a sudden gash of opened flesh and lipstick blood, the colour of Claudette Colbert's mouth on a cinema poster. "Good God, buddy," his buddy had said, "you'll soon run out of fingers like that." He lit the cigarette and dropped the box back in his pocket, flicked the spent match out into the motionless black river. A brief tracer of smoke followed it. The wagons were packed with the huge chunks of steam coal, and nobody was down there to observe him. A piece of dark, toothed out against the sky, to read what he might need. Everybody was elsewhere, at work. A few hundred paces away, over the bridge, in the yard stacked with doughty arches, near the lamp room was an office, and in it, some man sat at a desk. The young man would give his name there, announce a meaning for himself, and see a ledger open, join some list, or perhaps even walk into a job. He would do that. The smoke had filled him, answering a small craving. But he liked the railways. It gave him unreasoning pleasure to pin and unpin the brakes from Dowlais Top to Quaker's Yard, even to latch and unlatch wagons in icy sidings on bone-freezing mornings was vital somehow. to be involved in the flowing of people over the earth, in the ordinary processes of life. He extended his palms to blot out the black tangle of the dead river and looked calmly at the backs of his hands. He had to weigh all that against the 3 rented rooms, the infestation of black pats, the cockroaches with nowhere to go at the end of the terrace, corned beef and potatoes. They could, his wife was right, they could do with a bit more. But then there were the events, the changes. Under his nose, the end of the cigarette flared in needle points of heat. You could, so to speak, dig back down through history. For a decade and a half, events had fallen like annihilating snow. And indeed, there had been the worst winter anybody could remember. His father, after 50-odd years working in a place like this, had retired. Was the end of something an event? Surely yes. He had become a father himself. The baby was not a baby anymore, had been born in a hospital, a real hospital. There had been a significant election. He had travelled. In Madras, he had sat next to a young Englishwoman at a concert and talked with her of politics. He'd played cards with Lascars on the deck of a ship. He'd had dysentery. He had stood on islands on the other side of the world. He had married. There'd been the tribunal at which he'd argued his way out of a reserved occupation. There had been alliances, declarations, and so on. He had followed history's argument in those years. And so, right back, under the drift, to the boy not long out of school, crouching in the dark with a bloodied hand. And he had, somewhere in the middle of all this, between talking to the English lady about the meaning of Gandhi and becoming a father and the railway guard, somewhere there, he had killed a lot of people. Yes, that had happened too. The snow cleared from before him. He could see his left hand thrust forward over the parapet, the fingers curled as if holding something angled straight ahead. His right hand, in a similar attitude, was almost under his chin. Out of the silence, the throbbing of the compressors came back. There was a percussion of buffers and a dull rolling as the complicated Black River started to move under him. In self-defense, I would say there are lots of jokes in the novel.
There are a lot of jokes in the novel, to be honest. But no, that was another way of looking at history, wasn't it? Particularly the history of everyday history, ordinary people's history. But the question I've got written down for you, Chris, is one to do really with still and please, and also something you said about the energy that you put into poems and the being diverted from short stories, or was it vice versa? Anyway, so as a poet and as a fiction writer, could you tell us how big is the overlap, if there is an overlap, in the Venn diagram between the two forms?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot.
I'm sure you do.
If anybody's at the Hay thing, which is online as well as live, I'm sure it'll come up again there. But I think it's Bill that's being about that, so I think it's inevitable. But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've talked to other writers who also write poetry and fiction, and some people seem to make a great separation between them. And I can think of one very well-known novelist and poet who's told me that he finds it difficult to be writing poetry now that he's focusing on novels. But to me, I don't think it's just me. I think other people are in the same boat. I don't make that same separation. To me, when you're writing, the point is to make it as good as you can make it. You know, to come right down to the right word in the right place. You know, the right words in the right order, as Coleridge said. You know, that rule applies whether you're writing a novel or a short poem. It applies in different ways, maybe, but rule, I mean, requirement, let's put it that way. That need to be good is the same. The requirements of a piece may be different. Formally, they may be different, but then poems themselves can be formally different one from another, and novels can be formally different one from another. And so, I mean, I think it's very porous. I don't actually make that huge a distinction. Clearly, there are distinctions, you know. I mean, and we conventionally think of these things in that way, but it doesn't exercise me. I don't feel it a problem, you know, to move from one to the other. And I don't see creative prose as being that separate from poetry. And I sometimes said, it's a slightly mischievous way of looking at it, I think, but I've sometimes said that I think really good prose, in fact, I think Wordsworth said this, good prose is poetry and bad poetry is prose. But really good prose is as demanding as poetry is. In fact, in some ways, it's more demanding because the form is much more difficult. You have a big blank page and you have to flood it. And all you've got is the paragraph to get it into shape. With a sonnet, you've got all these other things that help you. You know, you've got a kind of corset that you can put it in. That kind of, in some ways, it looked at a certain way, it makes life harder, but in other ways, it makes life, you know, kind of not easier, but defined. You know, the tasks are more defined for you. In prose, you have to define your own task, and in that sense, it's extraordinarily demanding to be good.
That's a well-honed answer, I think. Rather like your writing, and you know, I don't think that I don't think people would call your prose poetic, but I think it shares with the poetry a certain sonorousness, if that's a word.
Well, I hope it's sonorous when it needs to be, you know, but there are times when you don't want it to be sonorous, you know. I know Aaron is a musician, you know, and sometimes you want that guitar to kind of move your ribs, and other times you want it to be thin and squeaky, you know. It just depends on what the demands of the form are. But yeah, sonority, yeah. Sometimes I think it is, yes. Other times you want it to be light and skip along, you know. You just want it to do the thing that it needs to do for the purposes of the piece, you know. I think it has to be fairly protean.
Yeah. Look, talking of zipping along, we need to zip along as well. Does anyone have any questions? The chat is just a continuous set of adverts for the book, the various books we've been talking about, which is a bit boring, really. Anyone anywhere? Meredith, are you nodding because you have a question?
It would have been quicker for me to have just said it. And, you know, a huge happy birthday to Seren. Just to say, Aaron's piece really reminded me of my grandmother. And we were in chapel one day and the minister asked, what do I look forward to when I go to heaven? And I said, riding a rhino. Because for some reason we had coloured in a picture of a rhino earlier in the day, and everybody in the chapel laughed. So, you know, I've got a lot of sympathy for Aaron in terms of, you know, that mentality about thinking about heaven and how messed up you are as a child about what heaven actually means. But I was just going to ask Mick about, you know, being, you know, Welsh, but working through the medium of English and maybe some of the authors, you know, how important is that factor of being Welsh and being a Welsh author, even though you're not writing through the medium of Welsh? Is it important? Do you think it travels well, or do you think well, it's important for you personally, but you don't think it's important for the reader?
Right. can I start off by saying that for Seren, Welsh content is very important. It's central to what we do and has been for the last 40 years. One of the things we're here to do is to reflect Wales back to itself, and also, if we can, to kind of push Wales forward a bit as well. And we do that through the books that we publish and the writers that we publish. Writers, any comments?
Can I say something? Because my mic's on, I know. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question for me to answer because, I mean, it's a bit like the old cowboy line, you know, you got to write what you got to write, and it's what comes out, it's what arrives. And I don't have any anxieties about whether it's Welsh or not. It's just the stuff that I need to write. And, you know, I happen to be Welsh, and it's I think, turns out to be pretty important to what I do, you know. As to whether it travels well, I think it would if it had the chance. I think you know, at a bigger level, I think one of the problems I see is that the Anglophone world, well, the Anglophone Britain, if you like, largely, the mainstream largely ignores us, whether we write in Welsh or in English. And given that England is the filter through which the rest of the world tends to see us, that's a problem. It becomes a wall rather than a filter. So, you know, I mean, there's that kind of a problem, and we have to deal with that in whatever way we can, you know, and build bridges, you know. But I mean, I think, you know, in my collection of poems, you know, I mean, there's a poem set in Cornwall, and there's one about crabs on a nesting beach in New England, and you know, and so on. So it's kind of the fact that I'm Welsh doesn't necessarily dictate or define the material I do. It's whatever I want to write. You know, it's whatever emerges. So it's I think other people do, you know, want to see certain anxieties in all of that, and sometimes it's in their eye rather than in the material.
Aaron?
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons I wrote Miriam, Daniel and Me, one of the reasons, there were several, but is that I feel in English, you know, that the North Wales experience of my childhood and youth has not been very well reflected in literature. I mean, that sounds like a grand thing to say. That, I mean, there have been notable exceptions, obviously. I mean, there's the ex-professor of poetry at Oxford, John Wayne, who wrote a couple of novels set in North Wales. But usually, when I went to university in England, and when I was there, they said, "Oh, you don't sound Welsh," you know. And said, "Oh, you must be happy that Wales are playing rugby and everyone." I said, "I don't care, you know. I'm football man, you know. I'm from North Wales." And they said, "Really?" And you know, said because you don't sound like Max Boyce, they assume that you're not proper Welsh, but. And that's the whole North Wales experience is something that's totally unknown. It almost took the super furry animals for people to realise that people can be Welsh with a different accent. You know, that people can hear Griff Rhys talk and realise that's what a North Wales person sounds like. You know, and I think that was a very important spur for me to write this book, because I feel there's about 20 different types of Wales, not just the one that everybody assumes with your leeks and your rugby and your, you know, and your singing hymns and arias, which is just as vibrant and just as vital as any other version of Wales. But I feel that there are others, and I feel that is something that I wanted to express.
Yeah, I mean, like we were saying earlier, actually, I mean. Earlier, i.e. before this call, when we were on the phone this afternoon, I mean, always worth having a look at Emma Humphreys, I think, for interpretation of Welsh. David, can I throw a kind of curveball at you, because you've published other sorts of fiction, haven't you, which includes novelizations of Torchwood and I think Doctor Who as well. I mean, is there anything from that speaks to the difference between Welsh and English audiences?
With Torchwood, it's interesting because that was always from the start was set in Wales. So that's been, I think I'm their kind of go-to person for doing Wales in a reasonably authentic way. So we did one quite recently where the guest star, and it was Susan Packer playing a Cardiff taxi driver called Fawzia. which was just, to me, that was like, that's you get driving your cab, you know, and she plays the part absolutely brilliantly. But it was so Cardiff. And because my frustration when the series started was that you didn't get Cardiff accents in it. You had people from Swansea playing somebody running a pizza shop in Cardiff, and I was like, where's that the Cardiff accent? You know, it was where's that one? Because I've lived here for 20 years, so I still find myself, I'll go into Greg's or something and ask for red Sirs, and it just kind of comes out like just a little bit of an inflection of what did I just ask for? But so I think that's been an outlet for that. But also I've got a short story coming up in a collection soon, which is based kind of Cardiff and valleys, and kind of going back to that from writing a novel that was set in one place that I'd been to and lots, you know, two places that I hadn't, and in times of history that I hadn't been in. But this was a very contemporary short story, just based on kind of observation and surroundings and things like that. So I like the opportunity to be able to do that, so I do identify as a Welsh writer, although not a Welsh speaking writer. So I mean, it's hard to get away from it when you've got 4 L's in your surname and one of the vowels is a Y. So, you know, there's no getting away from that. And I never wanted to. Maybe I should have used a pseudonym, only because there's another David Llewellyn who's written a biography of an Irish sculptor. And I once got asked to do a talk at the Royal Society of Sculptors on this woman, and I was like, that's not me. It was 150 quid. I almost took it, you know.
Take the money and run. Yeah.
But yes, so yeah, that's it. You know, it's like Chris was saying, you know, you write what you want to write, and sometimes that might be something set in the Soviet Union or Patagonia, or, you know, wherever. But also, every now and then, yes, it is just you see something in the street, or you hear something, or something gets you going, and it's your nearest surroundings. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
Thank you.
Can I just say that it's quite handy having a David Llewellyn who's going to get you work. There is actually a Christopher Meredith in California, I believe, who is a medium, and I occasionally get emails asking me how much I charge for a reading. I got the first time this happened, when I said, well, you know, I mean, they're actually asking me how much money I want before I do the reading. This is very rare, you know. I mean, usually they sort of say, oh, you want to get paid as well, do you? So I thought I was in the money, but then I got there was a very strange exchange of emails before I actually untangled what was going on here. So in spite of the fact that these people have looked at my website, where it says very clearly what I do right on the front page, they still think I'm Christopher Meredith, medium in California. So I think I might take it up as a sideline, you know, and I'll help Californians get in touch with their Auntie Lil or something. There'll be more money in it.
Yeah, we should do some sort of book about this, actually, because I mean, we are also the publishers of Tony Curtis and Peter Finch. And today we had Mike O'Brien, we've just published the dossier, his book about miscarriages of justice in South Wales. And he pointed out to me on Amazon that they have two author biographies for him. One is him, who he was part of the Cardiff News Agent 3, was wrongly convicted for a murder, and the other one was some Pulitzer Prize winning historian from Cambridge, Massachusetts, or possibly Cambridge, the UK. I don't know, but yeah, common names, they're everywhere. They really are. And how often Seren is mistaken for the Seren Care Home or Seren Insurance, or you know, we're in the wrong bit of business. I'm sure we are. No, we're not. We're really not, because we enjoy it so much. We've been doing it for 40 years, so we must do. So yeah, I think actually it's getting on. I need to put the rubbish out. So it's got to be time to say thank you all very much. Thank you to Aaron and Claire and David and Chris for really interesting readings and really interesting discussion. Thank you everyone for coming along and helping us celebrate Seren at 40. And we hope to see you again soon. But in the meantime, we'll all say good night. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye.